Okay, so this is the Bible study for 1 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. And the text says, Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to him, Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you. But Nahash the Ammonite replied, I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace on all Israel. The elders of Jabesh said to him, Give us 7 days so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you. When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. Just then, Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, and he asked, What is wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping? Then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. When Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel. Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. They told the messengers who had come, Say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, By the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued. When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated. They said to the Ammonites, Tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever you like. The next day, Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. Okay, well, that seems like a happy story. I guess it depends on who you are, perhaps. But remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And that way you can follow along as we read the questions and consider the answers and what God might have to say to us through this text. So number 1 says, what happened in our last week's Bible study? A, Samuel summoned all of Israel and gave them one last warning, but they still wanted a king. That's true. B, Samuel narrowed down the selection to Saul in front of all the people. That's true. C, Saul couldn't be found because he was hiding among the supplies. That was true. And D, everyone saw that Saul was a head taller than anyone else in Israel, but not everybody thought he could save them. We know that scoundrels at the end said, Can this fellow save us? And they were doubtful about his ability to be the help that they had hoped that they would get. Number 2 says, what happens in 11:1 through 4? A, Nahash the Ammonite besieged Jabesh Gilead, and that's true. So the Ammonites were neighbors of Israel, and if you remember, sometimes we've talked about the story of Balaam and Balak, who was a Moabite king. And we're not talking about that today. We're not talking about Balaam and the donkey and all of that. We've talked about that recently in our study of 2 Peter, if you're studying this with us at the same time. But that text, the reason the Moabite king was calling on Balaam to try to get Israel cursed was because he had heard about what Israel did to the Ammonites. And so there was fear in him, the Moabite king, because of Israel's interactions with the Ammonites. Well, that was before this text, but it wasn't the only time that Israel had dealt with the Ammonites. So the Ammonites were neighbors. The Ammonites were people that Israel had altercations with pretty regularly, and were a problem. And obviously, the Ammonites had rose up during this time and begun causing Israel problems. And so, anyway, if you look at a map, the Moabites are right there. The Ammonites are just north of there from Israel, and we're constant. I guess the word would be adversaries of Israel. B, the men of Jabesh basically surrendered. That's true. They said, "Oh, make a treaty with us, and we'll be subject to you." And that was, I guess, they just didn't want to fight. They were convinced they would lose, perhaps. They were not well prepared for battle. And if you go back and look at the maps, you'll find that Jabesh Gilead was on the outskirts, on the edges of Israel. In fact, Jabesh Gilead was actually across the Jordan River from most of Israel. And I think we won't get into this in Exodus. I think it's more in Numbers and in that area. But in the history of Israel, when the Israelites entered into the Promised Land, there were some of the Israelites that found good land before they crossed the Jordan and wanted to stay there. And of course, I think Moses's expectation was that they were trying to avoid fighting with their brothers for the Promised Land, but it turned out they actually left their women and children there. They went in to cross the Jordan with Israel and fought with Israel to secure the Promised Land and then return to their homes. But it was across the Jordan. So whereas most of Israel is sort of sandwiched in between the sea and the Jordan River, and that's kind of the boundaries, Jabesh Gilead was on the other side of the Jordan, and therefore vulnerable to the Ammonites and to anybody else, because they could be attacked while the rest of Israel's armies and their capital was further inland, or not really inland, actually closer to the sea, but further into the middle of the nation. So they were out on the edges, the outskirts. C, Nahash wouldn't accept surrender, but wanted to gouge out everyone's eye to disgrace Israel. I guess at some level, maybe this is not true. He said, yes, okay, surrender, but this is my only terms, is I'm going to do this to you if you surrender. So he was going to gouge out the right eye of everybody in order to bring disgrace on Israel. And I don't think that was kind terms. That wasn't acceptable terms to Israel. So they came up with a different plan. D, the elders of Jabesh asked for time to send messengers throughout Israel, and if nobody came to rescue them, they would surrender. Now, this is a kind of strange moment. I don't think this is the way battle would be done today. I know we have Geneva Convention and things like that, but the ways of battle was, we'd like to go get help. No, we'd like to defeat you without you getting help. That's the way most responses, I think, would come. But they said, no, we would rather go get help. And so apparently the Ammonites allowed them to wait, to send messengers out. They waited 7 days to see if the cavalry would come, to see if the rest of the army would show up. Apparently, either this was considered civil in terms of battle, or they didn't expect the help to come, and so they said, yeah, sure, whatever, 7 days, you can take a little time, we'll just wait, and then we'll gouge out your right eyes. Meanwhile, we'll probably party and just chill down here in the camp, and you guys will run out of food because you're under siege during this time. So they let them do that. Number 3 says, what happened when Saul heard the report from Jabesh, according to 11:6-7. The Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. So that's what verse 6 actually tells us. And I think that's probably strange to our hearing for a lot of us, because we expect the Spirit of the Lord to come on somebody, and then all of a sudden they get much more peaceful. Sometimes I think we think much more peaceful and easier to manipulate. The Spirit of God brings about calmness and peace, and it's so interesting that what the Spirit of God did in Saul was he caused him to burn with anger. Now I just want to say that there is such a thing as godly anger. There is such a thing as God being angry. And I believe when the Spirit of God comes upon a person, they don't become calm or become angry sort of in a vacuum as a matter of rule all the time, but rather what happens is when the Spirit of God comes upon them, they take on the emotion of God. They take on the character and the nature of God. So they become emotionally, they feel how God feels. And so when Saul was filled with the Spirit of God, when the Spirit of God came upon him, he burned with anger because God burned with anger against someone who would attack his people and not even give them reasonable terms of surrender when they weren't even trying to fight back. And all they needed to do was just make them subject to them, and they that would have been fine. But these people were unjust, and God cares about justiceness and justice, that's not a word, justice and righteousness and right treatment of people. And so God put a passion in Saul's heart for this. B, wait, I thought this king thing wasn't the will of God. So this has been something that's been kind of an ongoing conversation in this text, because God, the king, the fact that Israel wanted a king was Israel rejecting God, and this was not God's will, and he warned them about it. But let me just say that at some point, despite the fact that this was not God's plan, he began to work with the situation. And so I think we've talked about this before, but there's all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All of us have things in our past that were not the will of God. And aren't we glad that when that the grace of God is available to wash away that past, and God can work with what we've got. And so that's what he's doing. So this wasn't his will to have a king, and yet he chose a king and gave it to Israel, and he used that king for his glory and purpose. He used that king for the good of Israel, despite it not being his perfect plan. And so that's what's going on. See, he cut up a pair of oxen and sent the pieces to everyone in Israel and said, this is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel. So this is maybe a little extreme, but certainly seems to have been effective. He cut up oxen send it everywhere and say, if you think you're going to stay home and farm while all of Israel goes out to battle to rescue our brethren, then you are wrong, because you will not be able to farm anymore, because I will cut your oxen in half. So get your butts out here, excuse my language, and go to battle and fight for what is right. And that's what Saul's telling him. And it seems harsh, but it was certainly effective. Wait, what did he just say? Was that the Spirit of God? Let me just say that I believe that it was. And I think sometimes we're confused about the Spirit of God, the authority of God, how he gets things done. And we think that we have to be meek and mild at all times. And I think sometimes God would call us to be assertive. And sometimes God would call us to stand up for what is right, and use some perhaps extreme means at times to convince people to do the right thing. The terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. And I don't know if it was the terror of the Lord, if it was the terror of Saul and his chopping oxen up. But it seems like they were convinced to do the thing that God wanted them to do. And then 330,000 men came together as a mighty army, and he mustered them in this place. And this is how many people, it says, came in verse 8. And I guess this says 6 and 7, but let's say 8 to 6 and 8, 6 through 8. Number 4, what happened when the men of Jabesh Gilead heard the message of their rescue, according to verses 9 and 10? A, they stuck their thumbs in their ears and blew raspberries at the Ammonites. That's not what they did. They didn't do that. B, they told the Ammonites they were going to surrender tomorrow. Okay, nobody's come. We're going to surrender tomorrow. Wait, did I read that right? Yes, they lied. Oh my goodness. They told an untruth, and God used that too. I don't even know. I will say this, that it's pretty important in Scripture that we're not to bear false witness. It says we're not to lie. That's not what we're supposed to do. And yet I think one thing that's important is to understand is that in general, that is a very good principle. Don't bear false witness. Don't lie, because usually bearing false witness, when you apply it to the situation in which it was intended, what we realize is that you are not supposed to lie. And bearing false witness has a suggestion of court or justice being served, and us lying about what really happened, or lying about what the truth of the situation and fairness is. And that was generally in the judging among brothers and sisters of Israel. And in battle, this was a very different thing. Now, I've taken several ethics classes, and one thing that I've learned is that situational ethics is not good. It's not okay. We shouldn't be doing whatever fits the time and the situation and saying, well, this isn't okay here, but it is okay over there. But at the same time, I believe it was Kierkegaard talked about a night of faith versus a night of infinite resolution. And he was talking about what would you do if you were a German in Nazi Germany, or perhaps even an Austrian, or somebody in the territories where they took over, and you were hiding Jews from those who were gathering them up to murder them, and they ask you are you hiding Jews? Do you lie? And I think all of us can see in a situation like that where we would feel that telling the truth would be more evil than lying. Um, no, do we want to lie? No, that doesn't seem right. But in this situation, the other does not seem right either. And we have to decide not between right and wrong, but between what is terrible and clearly not the will of God, and something else that is generally wrong in most cases, but in this situation allows for the terrible thing not to happen. Um, and so that's not situational ethics. What he was talking about was being a knight of faith instead of being a knight of infinite resolution. When we talk about a knight of infinite resolution, what we would call that is legalistic. So rather than being legalistic and feeling good that we did the right thing by the code of conduct, even though it created these terrible results that God cannot be pleased with, we instead put our trust in God and do what we believe God has called us to do. And therefore, it's not our decision about the situation that matters, it's what God guides us to do in the situation that matters. And that's the difference between acting in faith, which may sometimes lead us to do things like, for instance, Jesus and his disciples picking grain on the Sabbath, which he considered right and said was okay, but a knight of infinite resolution would have never done that. But he defended his disciples against the Pharisees in that situation by pointing out that these laws were for our good, that the Sabbath law was for our good, and they were made for us, not us for the Sabbath. And therefore, we don't become a servant of the law, but rather we allow the law and these instructions that God has given us to serve God's purposes in our life. And so if we understand that those things were written to serve God's purposes in our life, then we understand that they are subservient to God himself. And if God is directing us about the proper thing to do, then we need to trust in him. Now, I don't believe that he's going to direct you to go murder someone in cold blood. Don't say that. I don't believe God's going to direct you to go and commit adultery and say that's all right. And so I just want to clarify that those things would be things that we would try to justify if we were using situational ethics. But those are not things that God would truly lead us to do and to justify. So we need to be following him and understanding that in some cases he may direct us to do things that we would normally not do, but for a purpose that serves his purpose. In this case, they lied. Number 5 says, what was the outcome in verse 11? The next day, Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke camp into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of day. Those who survived were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. And so this is, by the way, not murder in cold blood, but this is battle. This is attacking someone who had besieged a city that was not violent and not attacking them, and would not even allow for a peaceful resolution without gouging out the eye of every male in the city. So God visited wrath upon them through Israel. And we know that God's spirit came upon Saul in a mighty way and led to all of this. So this is an interesting text, and this is important because it's the beginning of really Saul becoming king. You know, we don't know how long had passed since he was anointed king, but we do know this, that he went back home and people went with him. Some time has passed, because this is no longer, it was not called Gibeah of Saul in our previous text, but all of a sudden this is Saul's place. This is where Saul lives, and these people sent people to Saul. And so it seems like he was not ruling, certainly not in Jerusalem as David did, and the kings after him. Um, and he was not ruling in some sort of castle, or what we tend to think of that kings would do. Seems like he was out in the fields, just really just being Saul and a part of his family and the things that people did, until he was called upon for God's purpose to protect his fellow Israelites. And then he rose up and became the figure that he needed to be, the leader that he needed to be, um, in order to fulfill God's purpose in his life and in Israel.